the age of invisible atmospheres. For a long time, Earth breathed without being seen. Gases rose, vanished, and returned without leaving a trace. The sky existed, but it did not yet matter. After Earth learned how to recycle its surface and interior, the atmosphere entered a strange and easily forgotten phase. This matters because before air shaped climate and life, it behaved more like a transient veil than a permanent system. Earth's early skies were unstable, invisible in their impact, and constantly rewritten by forces below and above. The atmosphere during this era was not a feature of the planet. It was a symptom, an exhaust product of geological processes that had no regard for what happened to the gases once they left the surface. Volcanoes release immense quantities of gas, but much of it did not linger. Without a stable composition, the atmosphere thickened and thinned repeatedly, collapsing into oceans or reacting with rock almost as quickly as it formed. There was no lasting balance, only exchange. Each volcanic episode injected a fresh pulse of gas into the sky, but without mechanisms to retain it, much of that gas was quickly recaptured by the very surface processes that had released it. Water vapor dominated many of these early skies, rising from a hot surface and condensing again in cycles that never settled. Carbon dioxide accumulated briefly, only to be pulled back into rock through weathering and subduction. Nitrogen began to build quietly, resistant to chemical capture, but it did so slowly, without spectacle. The composition of the atmosphere fluctuated with every major volcanic episode, every shift in surface temperature, every change in the rate of chemical weathering. From space, Earth would not yet have looked like a world with an atmosphere. There were no stable clouds, no defining color, no protective layers to announce its presence. The sky existed as process rather than structure. It was a transitional state, a phase of experimentation in which the planet tested countless atmospheric compositions without committing to any of them. Yet this invisibility was not weakness. It was preparation. The constant forming and collapsing of early atmospheres tested which gases could persist and which interactions mattered. Earth was refining its breath long before anything depended on it. Each cycle of atmospheric formation and collapse provided information about which chemical balances were sustainable and which were transit. The air was not empty, it was unfinished. And soon, that unfinished sky will begin to matter more than anything else on the planet. As these invisible atmospheres repeated their cycle of formation and loss, subtle shifts began to accumulate. Certain gases proved more resilient than others, lingering longer with each cycle and slowly altering the balance of the sky. Nitrogen, largely inert and resistant to chemical capture, continued to build almost unnoticed, forming the quiet backbone of a future atmosphere. Its persistence was not dramatic, but it was decisive. While other gases cycled rapidly between surface and sky, nitrogen accumulated because nothing efficiently removed it. At the same time, interactions between air, ocean, and rock grew more complex. Carbon dioxide no longer vanished immediately, instead cycling through weathering, sedimentation, and volcanic return in increasingly stable loops. Water vapor condensed and fell, but oceans now existed to hold it, preventing the sky from collapsing completely. Each exchange reduced volatility and increased persistence. The atmosphere was becoming less reactive and more durable with each passing cycle. The planet's gravity and magnetic field reinforced this change. Gravity held gases closer to surface, while the magnetic field shielded them from being stripped away by solar wind. Loss slowed, retention improved. Earth's atmosphere began transitioning from something temporary into something durable. The magnetic field's role was particularly crucial, as without it, the solar wind would gradually erode the atmosphere regardless of how much gas the volcanoes produced. Protection from above and supply from below created the conditions for atmospheric persistence. Still, this sky remained invisible in effect. Climate fluctuated without consistency. Temperatures swung widely, and no long-term patterns could yet take hold. The atmosphere existed, but it did not regulate. It responded rather than controlled. The gases were present, but they had not yet organized into a system capable of influencing planetary conditions in a sustained way. This was the build-up phase of the sky's story. Earth was assembling components of an atmosphere without yet activating its power. Composition mattered more than thickness. Persistence mattered more than presence. The critical transition was not from thin to thick, but from transient to enduring. The air was learning how to stay. And once it did, the planet would never experience silence in the same way again. As the atmosphere lingered longer with each cycle, its influence on the surface slowly intensified. Gases that once passed through without consequence now began trapping heat, softening temperature extremes, and allowing conditions to persist instead of resetting constantly. For the first time, the sky started shaping the planet rather than merely reacting to it. The greenhouse effect, which had always existed in a rudimentary form, now operated consistently enough to influence surface temperatures across extended periods. Cloud became more consistent, forming and dispersing in patterns that repeated across time. Rain followed recognizable rhythms, linking the atmosphere to erosion and surface chemistry in lasting ways. Wind began redistributing energy and moisture across regions, connecting distant parts of the planet into a single system. The air was no longer separate from the ground below. It was interacting with it. Atmospheric circulation created the first truly global transport mechanism for energy and water, linking equatorial and polar regions into a connected whole. These changes introduced feedback. Warmer temperatures increased evaporation, thickening clouds and altering rainfall. Cooler periods reduced atmospheric energy, calming circulation and stabilizing conditions. The atmosphere began regulating itself through interaction rather than collapse. Earth's surface and sky were learning how to communicate. The feedback loops that formed during this period became the foundation of all subsequent climate behavior, establishing the principle that the atmosphere and surface are not independent systems, but coupled ones. The build-up toward this moment was quiet but decisive. A sky that could persist long enough to influence outcomes transformed everything beneath it. Oceans responded to wind and temperature. Continents weathered under predictable cycles. Chemistry slowed into repeatable pathways instead of chaotic bursts. The surface processes that depended on atmospheric interaction could now develop long-term patterns, creating the geological rhythms that would eventually define Earth's environmental character. This was the emotional turning point of the invisible atmosphere. The sky had crossed from presence into power. It no longer vanished when conditions changed. It adapted, adjusted, and endured. The atmosphere had become a participant in the planet's behavior rather than a bystander to it. Earth was no longer breathing in fragments. It was beginning to breathe as a whole. The climax of this atmospheric transformation was the moment the sky became a system rather than a side effect. Earth's air no longer appeared and disappeared at the mercy of surface conditions. It persisted, adjusted, and interacted with the planet in ways that could be sustained across deep time. The atmosphere had become infrastructure. It was no longer the weakest and most transient component of the planet's surface environment. It had become one of its most essential. The resolution lies in what this made possible. A persistent sky allowed climate to exist as a long-term pattern instead of a series of accidents. Temperatures could stabilize within ranges. Weather could shape landscapes gradually. Chemical reactions could unfold slowly enough to matter. Earth gained a buffer between chaos and collapse. The atmosphere provided the planet with thermal inertia, chemical regulation, and energy distribution, three functions that together transformed a geologically active world into a potentially habitable one. This invisible atmosphere set the stage for everything that followed. Without it, oceans would not remain liquid, surfaces would not weather predictably, and life would never find consistency. The sky did not need to be dramatic to be powerful. Its strength came from endurance. The same quality that had once been the atmosphere's greatest weakness, its tendency to form and collapse, became its greatest strength once persistence replaced transience. What once went unnoticed became essential. The air learned how to stay, how to move, and how to regulate without drawing attention to itself. Earth no longer existed in silence between extremes. It existed within balance. The age of invisible atmospheres ended the moment the sky stopped vanishing. So, what do you think? Was this quiet transformation the most important one of all? The